This is Yahya Davidi, speaking to you from Jerusalem on behalf of Brit Am Hebrew Nations, a movement dedicated to researching the whereabouts of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and we have found them. We have proven that the lost 10 tribes of Israel are now to be found predominantly amongst Western peoples. And not only that, we have been able to focus in on certain groups and to say what tribes are predominant in different specific areas. And that is what we do, and that is what we are about, and that is what we exist to promote. In addition to that, we also take into consideration recent history and contemporary events and see how this too dovetails in with our findings and dovetails in with biblical principles that are an important aspect of what we occupy ourselves with. Today we're going to talk about the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur War took place on October the 6th to 25 in 1973, almost 30 years ago. For me personally, it was important. I won't go into the details. It had a great influence upon me. At that time I was in Australia, and almost 6 months after the war, I arrived in Israel in March 1974, and Israel has never been the same since. Neither have I, but I could say been many ups and downs since then. But on the whole, we have gotten on reasonably well, and I hope that both of us have, to some degree, benefited from the experience, especially myself. And anyway, we're going to talk about the Yom Kippur War now, not about yours truly. The Yom Kippur War took place almost 30 years ago, as we said, in 1973. Broke out on Yom Kippur, that is why it is also called the Yom Kippur War. It's a brilliant observation, but it's true. The war did break out on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is called the Day of Atonement. It is a day on which, also incidentally, the Yom Kippur, the day, the fast of Yom Kippur, is mentioned in the Bible as a day of affliction, a day of repentance. It's a day in which Jews ask that their sins be forgiven, and for about 25 hours, Jews do not eat or drink, and they usually pray all day long, and it is a very sanctified event, a very holy experience, and even non-religious Jews in the state of Israel keep the day. About more than 70% of the population keep Yom Kippur, believe it or not. And on that day, a great number of people are in their synagogues praying, or they're at home. Some of them rest up because it's difficult to go without food and drink for such a long time, and they want to conserve their energies. And most people, that's what most people do. There aren't that many cars on the roads. Not many people go to the beach or anything like that. They stay at home or they go to the synagogues, and they keep quiet. So the roads are empty. People don't phone each other, don't talk to themselves, to each other over the phone and so on. The communication lines are open, and a good portion of the neighbourhood is to be found in the synagogues, so that when the war did break out, from that point of view, it was an advantage, because it was easy to tell people what was going on, to get the reserves together, to call people up, because it was easy to locate them, as simple as that. And once they were located, it was easy to move them, or to get them to move where they had to move to. And where the Yom Kippur War was fought between Israel, the state of Israel, and Egypt in the south, and Syria in the north. The Syrians were also helped by forces from Iraq, tens of thousands of them. They had army units from Morocco helping the Syrians, also from Jordan. Towards the end of the war, there was an important force from Jordan that took place. There were Palestinian volunteers in the Syrian army, and the Syrians also had North Korean pilots manning the planes, and they had thousands of Russian advisors telling them what to do, as well as sophisticated Russian radar equipment and guns and cannons and tanks and so on. So Russia helped Egypt tens of thousands of advisors had been in Egypt not long beforehand. Most of them just before the war moved out, but the thousands remained, and they were directing and helping, and in the end protecting. They protected the Egyptians from complete obliteration towards the end of the war. But the war did not look that way at the beginning. The war took people by surprise. At least that is what is conventionally said. Another thing about the war, we should say it now, we'll return to this thing, the war, the Yom Kippur War, was also almost the occasion for an outbreak of nuclear confrontation between the USA and the USSR at that time. And the war had important consequences. After the war, America became a stronger supporter than Israel than she had been beforehand. Before the war, Israel had received a lot of help from France. France was the greatest friend that Israel had, to the degree that it had friends whatsoever. After the war, the USA invested and realized the strategic importance of Israel. Also, the USA realized that it had an emotional commitment, some type of a stake in the existence of the State of Israel, and the US presence and support of Israel became much greater. And the war took, they say the war took, as we said, as it's depicted, as if to say the Egyptians and the Syrians had suddenly attacked Israel, and it's not exactly that way. They were massing up troops on the border for months beforehand. They were preparing themselves. Everyone knew they were preparing themselves. There were 100 or something of a small number of Jewish outposts along the Suez Canal, and in the back of them, in the back of these outposts, had patrols, large-scale patrols, and deployment of armored corps, people units that could move back and forth. And they saw the Egyptians preparing themselves, and they also had people, spies in Egypt, told them that the Egyptians were preparing themselves, were about to attack. So in Syria, the king of Jordan himself had a secret meeting with the Israelis and told them that the Syrians were about to attack them. And they had a lot of information, and they knew that the war was about to break out, and they also had an idea, or no, they knew that the war would break out on Yom Kippur, and towards the end, just before the final breakout of war, they knew it was coming, and they knew what day it would come upon. So why didn't they preempt? Why didn't they attack first? They had done that on the 6-Day War. In the 6-Day War, the State of Israel suddenly found itself oppressed, surrounded by Arabs who had threatened to wipe her out, and had prepared themselves for war, and were provoking the Israelites, the Israelis, and wanted to wipe out the State of Israel. So the State of Israel made preemptive attacks and saved itself, and also gained a great victory. So why didn't they? And also they received the acclamation throughout the world. Most of the world was for them, and very happy that they had done what they had done. Anyway, before the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the situation had changed. The world climate had changed. The USA, within the USA, there were forces very critical of Israel. Also within the Jewish world itself, there were people, Jews overseas, who were critical of the State of Israel. The State of Israel was considered to be too warlike, to warmongering, to be too aggressive. And this had been promoted, this idea had been promoted by the world media, and all the nations of the world in effect were against the State of Israel. And Golda Meir, who at that time was the Prime Minister of Israel, she herself said that they couldn't be the first to strike. It had to be seen that the Israelis had been attacked from outside, had been attacked first, and were only defending themselves. This had to be as obvious, it had to be as clear as day and night. It had to be as black and white. There couldn't be no grounds whatsoever for any doubt on this point, even if it meant the loss of Jewish life, because the loss of world support also could lead to the loss of Jewish life, and it was a question of which loss would be greater. And so the decision was taken that the Israelis would not reply, they would not do anything. They would let the other side attack them. Golda Meir herself said, if we strike first, we won't get any help from anybody. That's what she said, and they knew that they would need help. At some stage or other in the war, they knew they would need help, as indeed they did. And they knew that if they would take the first blow, make the first blow, even if they could prove that they had no choice about it, others would not help them. So they had to stay there and let themselves be attacked. So that is the explanation that is given, and that is correct. There are a lot of quotations to show that this is indeed the attitude that was taken. The leaders of Israel themselves said as much. And another reason is given. There's another reason, however. It might sound far-fetched, but it is substantiated by different historical articles, observations, and those who were present at the time, who were reading what was going on and what the academics, people in the media were saying, what the experts were saying, and what they were saying before and during and after. And very often what the people in the high places, what the people in the newspapers and the radio and the commentators say, this is what takes place. Not always are they wrong. And this is not a conspiracy theory. We are against conspiracy theories. I do not believe in conspiracy theories. I think conspiracy theories are bad and harmful and misleading and historically not correct. But there is such a thing as some type of cooperation, of connivance, of the collective subconscious, or the collective consciousness of certain entities gives expression to itself without anything formally having been decided upon. And in this case it is not as the conspiracy theorists would want us to believe, people sitting around in some dark places and secret rooms around a table. These things that take place, the so-called conspiracy or connivance of different groups to do things, are to be read in the newspapers. In the light of day, that is where they take place. They take place before your eyes. They shout about them. Commentators come on talk shows and talk of them, and they create an atmosphere, and this atmosphere has an effect, and that is how the so-called conspiracy works. That is how you get parallel agreements that certain attitudes should be accepted, and they are accepted for good or for bad. This is what happens. So what was the idea that became accepted amongst a great many influential people? Though I'm talking about both amongst Jews, amongst intellectuals, amongst non-Jews, amongst the academics, amongst the think tanks, the military, the media. The idea was that the Arabs have a sense of pride. They're big on pride. They're big on saving face. They had been humiliated in 1967. The 1967 war, the Arabs had received a resounding defeat. The Arabs, therefore, would have a certain difficulty in coming to any peace agreement with Israel. Therefore, the state of Israel should allow itself to suffer a minor or a relatively minor defeat, let itself be beaten in battle, lose some of what it has gained. The Arabs would get their sense of honour back. They would feel better, as if to say, and they would, after that, come running to the peace table, and we could make peace with these Arab creatures, and we could all live happily ever after. The wolf could lie down with the lamb, and whatever you want could be done. That is what were the message that was given over, and there was something in it, because this is in effect what happened. As an outcome of the war, even though the Arabs had been defeated, they presented their initial successes as a victory, and they did eventually. Sadat, who was the initiator of the attacks on Israel in 1973, Sadat himself also led the initiation of establishing peace with Israel and making peace with Israel under Menachem Begin. And this so-called peace was not advantageous to the Jewish people, was not good for the Jewish state. We did not need it. We could have received the same results otherwise, the results being not fighting, not going to war, because that is the nearest to peace we can ever have with the Arabs, because they will always want to destroy us. And the only way we can permanently stay here is to beat them down whenever they raise their heads, or to always be strong enough to defeat them. And those who live in the land of Israel, who are causing trouble through terrorist acts and so on, should be sent away, as the Bible says they would be. They should be transferred elsewhere. So this is what should be done, and what should be done, and what is done, and what can be done. These are all different things, and we can go on discussing it, and we have discussed it. Now, getting back to the Yom Kippur War itself, so this was the feeling, this was a general consensus, as if to say, of sentiment, that the state of Israel should allow itself to suffer a minor defeat, and this is also one of the reasons why the Israelites did not react. And there were people on the front line, people saying there, they were seeing people looking, soldiers, Israeli soldiers in danger of their lives, facing the Egyptians, seeing hundreds of thousands of the enemy, massing themselves up on the other side, with their guns all trained up on them, and they're talking there, and they're relaying the information, and there's no reaction on the other side. And the war broke out. War of 1973 had been preceded. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 had been preceded by that of 1967. At the end of 1967, at the end of the Six-Day War of 1967, the Israelis were sitting on the Suez Canal. They occupied the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula stretches between Israel and Egypt. It is to the east of the Suez Canal. The area of Sinai in the past had pertained to the tribes of Judah and Simeon. It should belong to Judah or to Simeon. At all events, it is Israeli territory. It should be Israeli territory, and it was never really part of Egypt until about 70 years ago, when it was ruled by first of all ruled by the Ottoman Turks, who incidentally did not consider it administratively part of Egypt, and the British took over it. And somehow, otherwise, the British were ruling Egypt. They also took over the administration of Sinai, and when Egypt became independent, Sinai more or less fell into Egypt's hands, but it should not have been Egyptian at all. Before the war of 1973, in the period 1967-1970, in the canal area, the Suez Canal was dividing what was then the Egyptian part from the Israeli part of Sinai. And there had been a war of attrition in which the Egyptians were shelling and attacking Israeli soldiers on the other side, and a great many people were killed and wounded. And there was a lot of ongoing tension, and all of this may have been a contributory factor to Israel not wanting to defend itself in 1973, of war weariness, as if to say. And so this was the situation. And in the end, just before the war, there were about 450, only 450 each one. When I say only 450, obviously, each and everyone, like you and me, is very important. We are the beginning of the world and the end of it, as far as we and our families are concerned. But on a national basis, 450 soldiers is not a large number. 450 Israeli soldiers were spread over 16 different outposts on the edge of the Suez Canal, facing the Egyptians, and that is all there were there. And the Egyptians had 100,000 soldiers on the other side. The Egyptians also had 1,350 tanks, 2,000 guns, and they had heavy mortars. And Yom Kippur, suddenly on Yom Kippur, morning bays began to swarm across the canal, hundreds of thousands of them. And the Israelis attempted to defend themselves. They fought back, they shot, they fired, and the Egyptians just kept on coming on. Also, the Egyptians were highly motivated at this point. In the past, the Egyptians had been not so gallant, had not not always so heroic. They'd often run away from battle. This time they were pepped up and they were motivated, and they came on and they were shot down, and they kept on coming till they overran the Israeli outposts. A lot of these outposts fought to the death and inflicted great severe casualties on the Egyptian forces, and others surrendered. They had wounded, and the situation was hopeless, and they simply gave in. And all of the outposts were captured except for one in the north, and the Egyptians they just simply took over. And there were Israeli tanks in the area, began to attack, but they were beating back. They weren't that many, and there were much. The Egyptians had far more, and the Egyptians just shot up the Israeli tanks. Another factor that worked against the Israelis, that a lot of the Egyptian infantry came on with RPG, shoulder firing missiles. And just a simple infantryman puts an RPG up on his shoulder, fires, and one of those things can take out a tank. And they're quite accurate and quite effective, and the Israelis, for some reason or other, were not prepared for this. They had nothing to counter it with. And it's very difficult in desert conditions in Sinai to locate an individual soldier if you're sitting in a tank, to find out where he's shooting at you for, and to prepare yourself for it against him. And so a lot of the Israelis' tanks were destroyed. And so they retreated. The Israelis retreated because they had no choice. So the Israeli Air Force attempted to intervene, but the Russians had set up a barrier of SAM missiles which shot them down. A lot of planes and pilots were lost in the initial stages. And the Egyptians just came on, took over. And the Israelis were overwhelmed. The Egyptians came on, took over, and then they stabilized their lines within the range of the SAM missiles. And that is what the Egyptians did. And the Israelis were quite desperate. On the third day of the war, Moshe Dayan, who was then the Minister of Defense, he told Golda Meir, the Prime Minister, that this is the end of the Third Temple. They thought the State of Israel might be finished. They may have considered using nuclear weapons. Israel apparently does have nuclear weapons, and there are reports that Israel did consider using them, but they didn't. On this day, on the third day of the war, Henry Kissinger told the Israelis that President Richard Nixon, who was then the President of the USA, he had agreed to replenish the Israeli ammunition stocks and to replace the aircraft and the tanks. And so an airlift began over the Americans, bringing vast quantities of tanks, planes, ammunition, and everything that was needed to the Israelis. And they flew it in from America, and no country in Europe, apart from Portugal, would allow the planes to refuel and do what had to be done before flying on to Israel. And if it was not for Portugal, we would have been in very serious straits. Even Britain did not allow the Americans to refuel at their bases, because all of these countries were afraid of an Arab oil embargo, and all of these countries are dependent upon Arab oil, and they did not wish to antagonize the Arabs. So they refused to allow the planes that were coming to help the Israelis save themselves from refueling. But Portugal at that time had its own reasons for allowing the Americans to do so, and since due to the help of Portugal, the Americans were unable to do so, and they brought in tanks and they brought in everything that was needed in great quantities. In the meantime, the Egyptians were also replenishing. Both the Syrians and the Egyptians where also in Syria in the north a similar situation had taken place, and the Russians were refurbishing, were giving, resupplying both the Egyptians and the Syrians. This was the first stage of the war. And also Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was in a communist nation, and Yugoslavia, but independent under Tito, or the successors of Tito, and they also gave a great number of tanks to Egypt, possibly at the urging of Russia. at all events with the with the approval of Russia and the cooperation of Russia. And their tanks were Russian, of the highest quality. The Russians are good. They were good in a lot of cases. Their weapons were at least as good as those of the West, sometimes superior, not always, but very often this was the case. And this was what was happening. There was also another thing, another point that we should mention, that the Israelis reorganized, they got themselves together somehow or other. They managed to hold the Egyptians back. The armor units, so the units of tanks from now on would receive additional complements of small numbers of infantry riding in armored personnel carriers, and these armored personnel carriers and other small mobile vehicles with very very high-powered machine guns, and both the infantry and the machine guns were what was necessary to counter the Egyptian infantry and to shoot anyone who tried to fire RPG missiles at Israeli tanks. And on the whole, this was successful. It did at least provide some degree of protection. It did do what needed to be done. It was better than nothing at the very least. And the Egyptians began to, also after receiving resupplies and replacing their losses in tanks and ammunition, the Egyptians began to continue their advance northward. And the Israelis met them. The Israeli armor, the Israeli infantry met them, and somehow or other held them back, beat them down, or beat them off, or slowed up their advance. But in the course of the fighting, the Israelis revealed a gap between the two Egyptian armies that were two major Egyptian armies that were involved. They found a gap between these armies, and they penetrated this gap. And they got in behind the Egyptian lines. They got in on the other, they came across the canal, across the Suez Canal. They brought great big, enormous prefabricated bridges or rubber dinghy, enormous inflatable rubber dinghies that can be linked together. And the roads stretched out across them for tanks to cross over. And they had 3 or 4 of these bridges set up. And they managed to get their forces across to the other side of the canal behind the Egyptian armies, and the Egyptians at this stage didn't really know what was going on. The Israelis in the back of the Egyptian armies had these units roaming to and forth throughout Egypt, and they were able to wipe out, destroy the SAM missiles. Therefore, the Egyptians no longer had the protection of the Russian missiles. Therefore, the Egyptian troops were exposed to visits, unimpeded visits by the Israeli Air Force, which is very important. And also the Israelis managed to destroy a good portion of the civilian infrastructure and to attack the Egyptians from both ends, and they cut the Egyptians off from their supplies, and the Egyptians were cut off from water. In the end, the Egyptians were in danger of losing 1/3 of their forces through thirst. It was only because of the intervention of the USSR, of the Russians and the USA, that water was flown in to help these poor, unfortunate Arab Egyptians who suddenly found themselves with nothing to drink in the hot weather. And even without hot weather, nothing to drink leaves a person with nothing to live for, nothing to live on. And this is important. A friend of mine, we should remember that, incidentally, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, or an associate of mine, because on a hot day, on a day of exertion, he did not drink enough. He suffered heat stroke, and this almost killed him, and it left him permanently damaged for the rest of his life. So you should always make sure that you drink enough, drink plenty, especially on hot weather. And also children. Children have a habit of running around and exerting themselves and not drinking enough. And they dry up and they suddenly get sick. And suddenly weather, one should make sure that children, everyone, especially children, drink as much as they require or more. It doesn't harm to overdo it. At all events, the Egyptians were in this situation. A good portion of the army, the main army, the whole of the Third Army was in danger of dying of thirst, of being wiped out. The Israelis were already in Africa. They were in Egypt. They were roaming to and fro, up and down the west bank of the Suez Canal. They were within striking distance of all the major Egyptian cities. They were not that far away from Cairo. They could have conquered it with ease. They could have, the whole of the Egyptian continuum was in danger of collapse, of a complete obliteration. And the Russians were under pressure. The Russians demanded a ceasefire, and they also considered sending in tens of thousands of soldiers to rescue the Egyptian and Syrian allies, because the Syrians also were in trouble. What was happening in the north? At the same time, the very same time when the Egyptians had attacked in the south, the Syrians had attacked in the north. And they had also achieved an initial success. They were on the whole of the fighting of Syria with Israel concerned the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights are like an escarpment, an elevated plateau. On one side it looks down on Syria, into Syria. On the other side it looks down into Israel. And this is a plateau, the Golan Heights, rocky mountainous plateau. And the Israelis had conquered it from Syria in 1967. And the Syrians came up with their tanks, with their soldiers. And the Syrians had a reputation for being good and fanatical fighters, and they were. They were quite formidable. And they had also outnumbered and overwhelmed the Israelis. They had the forces on the Golan Heights are about 180 Israeli tanks at the beginning. 180 Israeli tanks against 1,400 Syrian tanks. Not 10 times as many, but 8.5, 9 times as many. And the Assyrian attacks, they were ferocious. And initially they overwhelmed the Israeli forces. The Israelis were taken over. The Israelis fought back. A lot of Israelis fought to the death. They fought back. And because of the nature of the terrain, the Syrian advance was split up into different sections, and it was mountainous. And here and there, Israelis, individual Israeli troops, soldiers, managed. A lot of the fighting was done in tanks, and there were one or two instances where one tank would hold off hundreds of Syrian tanks by jumping around, by firing from one position, moving out, firing from another position. And when his own tank was hit, jump into a disabled tank which was still able to fire, and fire from that. And the Syrians were advancing, and they were not aware that there was hardly anyone against them. They fought. They were under the impression they were coming up against a formidable force, so they slowed down. Sometimes they stopped altogether. And this happened all over. The Israelis fought back. The Israelis were wiped out here and there, but here and there they also managed to hold their own. And somehow or other they managed to slow down the Syrian advance, but the Syrians were already up on top. They were overlooking. They were looking down into the Galilee. A little bit more, and they would have been there. They would have been in the heartland of Israel. They somehow or other, the Israelis stopped them. The Israelis also managed to get the artillery into play and to be able to shoot up the Syrians from long range. Another thing is that the Syrian advance into Israel had also been under the umbrella of the Russian missile system, of a very sophisticated Russian missile system, somewhat different from that in Egypt, but on the same level, or a higher level of sophistication even, and it was run from a suburb of Damascus, where they had a whole network of electronic devices, of electronic controls concerning this, connected with the protective missile system. The Israelis were not able to do anything about it. The Israeli planes came in and tried to help the forces on the ground, and they were shot down. Pilots were killed. But a force of Israeli planes managed to fly out into the Mediterranean, come in from Lebanon, come in from behind the Syrian lines once again, go into Damascus, into the city of Damascus, and without harming too much the civilian population, to focus in, to home in on this electronic network of Russian radar setup of controls for this missile system, and they took it out, they blew it up, they destroyed it, and that greatly diminished the effectiveness of the missile umbrella, so that Israeli planes henceforth were unable to attack the Syrian ground forces. Israeli artillery was also coming into play much more effectively. Also, the Israelis, after being overwhelmed and pushed back and somewhat shell-shocked from the whole experience, had also recovered themselves, reorganized, and these forces all together managed to push the Syrians back off the Golan Heights into Syria, and then they were coming down, and they were also about to take over Damascus. The Lubavitch Rabbi in New York, he knew what was going on. He was receiving reports, and he was urging the Israelis to take Damascus. Israelis hesitated about conquering Damascus because it means controlling civilian population. It could have meant conflict with Russia. There were all kinds of considerations. Israelis held back, but they were on the verge of doing so, even against their will. If the fighting had continued, they would have been in Damascus. And so the Russians were almost frantic. They were hysteric. They wanted a ceasefire, and because now the Israelis were winning. There's a Russian fleet. Then Russia was ruled by Brezhnev, a Russian fleet with 6,000 naval infantrymen, like Marines, sailed to the eastern Mediterranean, into Assyrian harbours. Incidentally, the Israeli planes now attacked this Syrian infrastructure, blew up important installations and important militarily significant targets. They also sank a Russian ship in the Syrian harbour, and they were more or less in complete control, or assuming complete control. And so the Russians were very intent on doing something. The Russians, in addition to these 6,000 soldiers already in Syria itself, or almost in Syria, in the harbour, just off the coast, there were another 50,000 Russian troops in southern Russia who were on preparation, who were on alert. It's a 60-minute alert to fly to Israel, or to fly to Syria. And the whole of the Russian southern front was in preparation, and President Nixon and under his Secretary of State Kissinger also realized what was going on, so they placed the US forces at Defense Condition 3. Defense Condition 3 is supposed to be very close to actual war preparedness. The USA was ready for war. The USA was ready for war in defense of Israel. And for a couple of minutes, for a few hours, it wasn't certain how things would play out. In the end of the two sides, each side backed down. The ceasefire was placed into effect. And that was it. That was the end of the war on an official level. There was a few things carried on from then, but as far as the fighting was concerned, it was over. The Israelis had suffered about 2,521, 2,800 killed in action, it's not certain. About 8,000 other soldiers were wounded to some degree or other. 293 Israelis had been captured by the Syrians and the Egyptians. Incidentally, they were treated very badly. Both sides, both the Egyptians and the Syrians. The Egyptians and the Syrians killed Israeli captive soldiers and tortured them. The Syrians especially were barbaric, sadistic, cruel, and proud of it. And it was not worth going into captivity if you were going to be placed in Syrian hands. You were better off fighting to the death. The Arab losses were obviously 10 times or much more, maybe 20 times as high as those of the Israelis. It's not certain. They also suffered a great deal more to the infrastructure. And that was the total. Henceforth, the USA became the main supporter of Israel. Before then, France had been the main supporter. And the strategic value of Israel was greatly appreciated from then on. And also American hearts, in America itself, there was an awareness, an arousal towards the state of Israel. As if the state of Israel had strategic value, it also had biblical significance to the American nation. It meant something to them. It was something part of themselves, an expression of their other being, as if to say. And more and more Americans came to realize this. As a result of the war, the USA quadrupled, increased by 4 its foreign aid to Israel. It replaced France as Israel's largest supplier of arms. And from then on, the Americans tried to see that the Israelis had a qualitative edge over all of their potential enemies in the neighborhood. Also, Congress before the war had trouble passing relatively low loans, $535 million a year, so on, by a few votes. After the war, Israel began to receive about 4 or 5 times more than that each year, with no trouble at all, half in loans and half in grants. Almost all the money that Israel received went to purchase American hardware. America benefited from it. Also, the Israeli improvements and the Israeli input to the development of this hardware was of great value. No one can deny this. The Israelis gave something back, and this the qualitative edge sometimes is worth a lot. It's better than the quantitative one. Maybe to some degree, thanks to Israeli input, what the weapon, the merit that America had, also the technology that it had, was much better than otherwise would have been, and it was much more suited to war conditions, actual war conditions. So that was as far as America. As far as Israel is concerned, there was an upheaval in Israeli society. After the war, there were elections, but nothing changed very much. But a few years later, in 1977, Menachem Begin became prime minister with the Likud party, and he effected a revolution in Israeli society and in the Israeli economy. Things changed altogether. I was in Israel, I experienced it. It was a genuine upheaval, a reorientation of thinking, a reprioritization of values, of considerations, and respect for one's fellow man, one's fellow person also increased. And this change was an outcome of the war itself, at least to some degree. Also, as a result of the war, I came to Israel, and for me that's a big thing. And so thank you. May we all learn from this. I hope you have enjoyed this talk. May the God of Israel be with all the children of Israel, with the Jewish people, with the Israelite nations from the lost 10 tribes, and may we all grow and become closer to the truth. Thank you very much.